we're going to kind of try to discuss reflection that we have been developing in the last years about perhaps the importance of looking better at what is in the visual impact of renewable energy technologies, and maybe theoretically and also empirically reflecting about and examining different dimensions of that visual spatial impact, as we will propose. So obviously the reflection, this reflection departs from the observation that there is still a lot of opposition by local communities to specifically large-scale renewable energy generation and associated technologies and infrastructures. And it's quite interesting as well how this picture on the left, I think I spotted it in more than one presentation today. So it's clearly one of the first that comes up in a Google Scholar search when we search for opposition to wind farms, I suppose. But in any case, what this one image and many other ones that show up on Google Scholar, for that matter, on Google's for that matter, when we do this type of search, is really that one of the main dimensions that seems to explain or be associated with people's opposition is for sure the visual impact of these infrastructures. And that is something that has been also highlighted by a lot of social science research looking at the social acceptance of renewable energy technologies. And there are a lot of papers coming from different perspectives within the social sciences that have been examining specifically the visual impact of this type of energy infrastructures and its relation with social acceptance as well. However, despite the fact that this is kind of already a well-known result, so to say, and also that there has been actually a lot of research published on this aspect of people's responses to renewable energy technologies. As Martin Volsing has recently put it, the visual impact of renewable energy technologies is conceptually a highly complex and still frequently misunderstood topic in these social sciences studies on people's responses to renewable energy technologies. And in fact, when we started thinking about this, we went back to a lot of the literature's reference to this visual impact, and we did it a bit like in a chronological order. And as you can see here, this has for sure been a key dimension present in a lot of key studies and papers on social acceptance. But there's also the sense that authors are often referring just to this kind of general concept of visual impact, but without specifying exactly what it means, what is in the visual impact of renewable energy technologies, specifically at what level are they talking about the visual impact, etc. And so this is really our point of departure is maybe it's worth it to actually look better at this literature and at how it has been looking at this visual impact of renewable energy technologies. So that's what we aim to do here, is to discuss with you a little bit this unpacking of this notion of visual impact as an important factor to social acceptance. And in so doing, we aim to also try to, on one hand, and following up on again, Martin Volsing's proposal, contribute to a better understanding of how to create space for fitting infrastructure within landscapes. And also on the other hand, and as suggested by Matthias Naumann and David Rudolph recently, by also acknowledging that it is important to further consider the rural in energy transitions. And one of the ways to do that might also be to pay more attention to the physical impact, so the visual spatial impact of energy infrastructures on rural landscapes specifically. So to do that, what we thought could be important to do, at least as a first step, is to actually consider that research on the visual impacts of renewable energy technologies can be characterized so far by focusing on three main dimensions of this visual impact. A more individual dimension, as we call it, which refers to research that has been focusing mainly on studying visual impact as physical appearance and the visibility of these energy infrastructures. A more community local focus, so that would be another dimension, and this type of research has been discussed here already often today and yesterday. So research that focuses more on issues of place impact and project place fit. And perhaps then another dimension to also consider is how these issues of visual impact also translate a more societal or national global dimension that refers to RET's impact on landscapes or landscape traditions. So just quickly going through these kind of three dimensions and the related literature and research. And regarding the first one, so this first dimension and this first strand of research has been really looking at mainly at what energy infrastructures are being deployed. And so we've called it a strand of research that mainly looks at visual impact as visual pollution created by renewable energy technologies. So part of this trend of research is, for instance, work that is often done as part of the environmental impact assessments by consultants and practitioners, and the assessment of zones of visual impact of intrusion of the energy infrastructures. But also academic research, such as studies applying more perceptual or cognitive perspectives, and that look at energy infrastructures as lacking or having certain visual qualities and coherence or lack of it in relation to the surrounding context. And also studies that apply economic valuation approaches, such as willingness to pay for visual impact. So this strand of research tends to equate then visual impact with mere visibility, as also highlighted by Martin Volsing. And the main focus of this strand of research tends to then be on the physical appearance of turbines and pylons, such as their size, color, and shape, and how these can be transformed to increased social acceptance. So in our view, this is a strand of research and a perspective that tends then to commodify renewable energy technologies and their spatial deployment. So to see them more as a product, as something that consumers might like less or more, and therefore as something amenable to economic valuation within neoliberal capitalist political and economic systems. And so, as you'll see, it's also a part of this reflection and proposal to kind of contest and overcome this individual focus as such on the visual spatial impacts of RET. So another strand of research is obviously the one that has been developed a lot by Patrick Devine-Wright and also other authors, and that looks more at the community local level and at visual impact as more the project place fit. So the fit between a certain technology and a specific infrastructure and the place where it is located. And finally, another also quite well-known strand of research is research that has tended to focus more on the visual impact and its relation to social acceptance as the result of cultural and institutional factors. And so, contrarily to the other two strands of research, so the first one, as I said, focuses more on what RETs are being deployed. The second one more of on where RETs are being deployed, so project place fit. And this one we suggest is more focused on when are renewable energy technologies being deployed. And so here with the when, we aim to highlight that this dimension refers more to certain periods of time that at, again, cultural and institutional levels allow more or less for certain types of infrastructures to be more accepted in a given society or less accepted in that same society. So research that makes part of this larger strand and contributing to the study of this dimension is obviously the research that has been looking at the role of landscape traditions and their reproduction in planning systems, different mass media, and also in people's everyday practices. And that has been showing then how landscapes are cultural imaginaries that have changed over time in specific cultural and spatial geographical contexts. So one example is obviously the British countryside and all the research that has shown how this kind of cultural representation or imaginary of the British countryside is one of the main reasons for people to perceive renewable energy technologies as being visually menacing the essence and the characteristics of that British countryside. So to sum it up, we propose that when we are thinking about the visual impact of renewable energy technologies, we should really be always thinking about these three dimensions. So the individual, community, local, and societal, cultural, institutional dimension, and through that, looking always at not only what, which specific energy infrastructure is being deployed, but also where and also when. So how does it relate with larger cultural and institutional meanings and practices? So by proposing this kind of more relational approach, we aim to, on one hand, clearly go beyond the concept of visual impact as such, because as Martin Volsing has already highlighted, and we further emphasized here, that tends to mainly only refer to RET's physical appearance and visibility. And we think that really what we should be looking at is more as at the visual spatial impacts of renewable energy technologies, as the interrelations between individual, local, community, and cultural levels. Another assumption or premise that we also want to put forward is that conceiving ideas, so the individual dimension of the visual spatial impact of renewable energy technologies should be seen really as the articulation again of both cultural and local representations of landscape and place, and more subjective representations based on life, place experiences and trajectories. So not as much focus on the individual dimension as people's perceptual and cognitive ways of seeing a specific energy infrastructure, but more again based on these life, place experiences and trajectories that will then also shape their relation with specific energy infrastructures. And finally, adopting conceptual and analytical tools that enable the analysis of those closely interrelated dimensions and how people's meaning making and relations with renewable energy technologies are constructed with reference to those three dimensions. So I don't think I have too much time. So just to say that this is still a work in progress, but our proposal is really that we might use certain analytical tools from social psychology, in this case anchoring and objectification, that might help us to identify how do people make sense of the visual spatial impact of renewable energy technologies in relation to these three dimensions in their discourse and communication. And just very briefly, anchoring is an analytical tool that has been proposed by social representations theory, a social psychological approach to how people make meanings about the objects around them, that refers to the fact of people always making meaning about those objects in reference to previous and familiar knowledge, and objectification, highlighting how people also make meanings about those objects by associating them with familiar images and metaphors. So again, just to highlight that Patrick has already used social representations theory in this field to analyze precisely people's meaning making at a more local level. And so we suggest that that is also expanded to see how the more cultural and institutional dimensions and the individual dimension as well show up as part of that process of meaning making in relation to the visual spatial impact of red. So just to wrap it up, I'm not going to go through the empirical examples then, but if all goes well, you'll be able to look into those soon enough in a publication. But I think the most important part of this reflection is really reflecting about these three dimensions to think about the visual impact of renewable energy technologies and what they might allow us to do. So thinking about those interrelations. And I think that one of the most important aspects is really that this might also help us to further shine light on the power relations that shape the so-called visual impact of renewable energy technologies. So it's a bit going back to even Robert's and Alex's presentation, is being able to also think about the visual impact of red in its materiality and as materializing ideological relations and power relations between different groups in a given society. So I'll leave it there. But do ask questions or make comments if you have any. Thank you.
Thanks. A great presentation and great work, and a really useful way of framing, putting it into those three buckets. My question really goes to the framing of it as visual impact. The word impact, and then then highlighted by the word pollution as well. But a lot of people think of these as positive, and so I would think that we might want to use the term effect, because an effect, impact has a sort of negative connotation, whereas effect can be more positive or negative. And some people find them in place, some people find them beautiful, some people find them representing clean energy progress. So all of those things, to me, suggest that we would like that effect would be better than impact, and not to talk about things like pollution.
Yeah, thank you, Jeremy. Yeah, I think like that's a really good point, and we were or I was trying to criticize the notion of visual pollution as well, but I also think that replacing that by talking about impact, as you said, might also have that problem that I also agree that impact seems to suggest a negative impact. So that's a really good suggestion from my perspective. And I think that, yeah, probably talking about effect or any other notion that might be more amenable to accommodate both positive and negative relations with the technologies is for sure a better way to go.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, and then Jamie has a question kind of on the use of VR and VR goggles. Jamie, do you want to come online and ask that?
I was just thinking about what we saw yesterday with, and we've seen a few different projects that use VR goggles to engage with communities, and I'm wondering, how these two things might intersect. Where I spoke yesterday about commentary that might go along with the VR goggles, and now think about how your grandmother used this space decades ago. How is there a way that is this an argument against that kind of thing, or is it something that could be that could work in harmony with engaging with communities. When I look at those 3D images, they seem fairly sterile. And is that simply, am I the last to the party here and getting the point?
Yeah. No, like it's a really good question. As I think it could be coupled up with thinking about these other dimensions, but I think it really depends on how you do it. So yeah, probably if you use like these VR simulations that just project wind farms, for instance, in a very sterile landscape that doesn't have to do with the real landscape, and you also don't ask people about what else do they think about when they think about wind farms being deployed in that place and all that, then I think we wouldn't support that type of approach. So I think that if you use VR simulation, but then you allow for people to also highlight that it might be more than only that specific infrastructure in that area, but actually their responses are also related with other meanings about that place and the meanings of their, like that their grandfather of parents used to attribute to that place, for instance, then I think it should be fine.
Thank you. And if you take it to the nth degree, I imagine you would, by the time you're done, you end up with a video game.
Yeah.
I do think it's a good question there, Jamie, because in some ways we're not saying whether a technique like VR should be applied or not, but I guess we're asking questions about what would be the justification for needing to do it in the first place, and that's probably against the background of assumptions of visual pollution or destroying landscapes, etc. So it's not so much the technique of doing it, but the justification behind it that I think would be interesting, as well as what Susana was saying about what kind of assumptions are made about the landscapes people actually look at. And I think some of these issues are raised in a paper that Susana and I looked at published a couple of years ago, about the concept of essentialization of the countryside, where actually even people living locally have quite interesting ideas about what that local countryside looks like and is replete with, and completely contradictory ideas in many cases about whether it's full of infrastructure or not, or a peaceful place that will be ruined by new infrastructure. So I think these matters are actually formidably complex and need quite a bit of nuance in order to break them down, which I think is a central point, really, that having the 3 dimensions that Susana just outlined helps us further to understand the complexity of how considerations of the visual are relevant to the siting of renewable energy technologies.
Thanks, both.
Yeah, thanks for that, Patrick. Ben has, I think, a really important question, moving on kind of from the theory. And Ben, come online if you want to ask this via video about the possible analytical or applied tools that might come from this work, or maybe should be used with your understanding of theory here.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is fantastic. Thank you so much. I always appreciate hearing from the two of you. So in terms of taking this and applying it, I mean, it maybe gets back to what Jamie was just asking about. Have you guys started to think a little bit about how this could be taken from a theoretical model into something that is actually applied in the field? Might have some way that a community and the stakeholders in that community and developers, or whatever the case may be, might be able to sort of characterize this and then use it to develop a project that might work best in that community. And I just want to also recognize, maybe this is something similar to what Jeremy said, is that, from the work that others have done and we have done, there's so much heterogeneity in these views that it would also need to be accounted for. There's clearly no kind of average in reality. There is an average you can calculate, but but in reality, there's a great deal of heterogeneity. So those are the sort of two questions I had, and I'll mute my line now.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ben. I think starting with the last one again. Yeah, I'm sorry, like I didn't go through the kind of empirical examples. So these were quotes from actually newspaper articles, UK newspaper articles, in which we try to exemplify people's stances, so to say, regarding the visual spatial impact of specifically wind farms on a place and a landscape. And for instance, one of those examples was actually by someone who highlighted that for them, the wind farms looked like silent workhorses. So it was for sure a positive visual impact. So just to say that we are, I mean, again, I agree with Jeremy that impact perhaps is in common sense, it gives more this idea of a negative impact, and so probably it should be changed. But I don't think that we ever thought about this as always, as visual impact always having to entail negative kind of emotions or perceptions by people. So it can also obviously be positive, and I think what we're trying to highlight is that it will be positive if we are in a socio-historical cultural context, and in a specific kind of project place context, and with a person specifically kind of life place trajectory that allows her or him to have a positive evaluation of a specific project. And so what we're trying to say is that really, if the response is positive or negative or something in between, is a result of these three dimensions. And so, yeah, having said this, I don't think like I have not thought too much yet specifically on how this could be translated in practice, but I think that for sure all the talk that has been happening here about you know, involving more people in decision-making processes and allowing them more to talk about place meanings and how they make sense of these changes is for sure a good way to go. So I think that what we know, or what we would advise, is that for sure consultants and environmental impact assessments, as we highlighted, go beyond just assessing, okay, this infrastructure is going to go there and it's visible by this amount of people, so that's that. So that's what the only thing that we should take into account. So it's for sure much more than that, but yeah, I don't know if Patrick has more specific ideas about that.
Well, I think the only thing that occurs to me that's useful to add at this point is that it's just the idea of balance. So I think one of the things that's intrigued me for many years is there's been a triangular framework for over a decade now, and questions have been asked by Martin Wolfsink and others at various times. Are we spending too much emphasis on this part of the system? What about the rest of it? And how much are we doing? And I think in some ways we're addressing that here, saying that when you consider these issues of visual effect or visual response, etc., how much effort are we putting as a research community into these three different interdependent dimensions? And the data that, if Susana had more time, she would show, is from a media analysis of UK national newspapers over a 6 to 10 year period. And if you want to properly reveal the more socio-cultural level, the institutional level within which individual judgments of visual pollution, etc., are being made, then maybe you need to put you need to emphasize that in the research process. So it's not to say that you always have to do that, but I think an imbalanced field would have lots and lots of studies at the very individualistic level and not too many at the more socio-cultural level or at the community level. And I guess we're not saying that a single study has to do all of these, but an area of research as a whole and a community of scholars could be paying attention to all of these dimensions and really making it more clear in the publications that they recognize that they're looking at this bit of the picture, but there's other pieces of the jigsaw that they understand are relevant but may not be explicitly tackling in that piece of research. And I think that's one of the values of this in terms of its practical application on research, at least.
Yeah, thank you. That was very interesting.
Okay, thanks for that, Patrick and Susana. We have a question from Marinush about what is kind of determined to be ugly today might be praised in the future, using the example of the Eiffel Tower. Marinush, do you want to ask the question? Maybe Marinush doesn't have video. Yeah, so if either of you want to kind of tackle that question, the question is, do you think what is being considered as visual pollution today can be changed by informing communities about the advantages of infrastructure, maybe such as wind turbines or solar panels?
Well, yeah, the part of the kind of socio-historical and cultural changes in what is acceptable and not in a given landscape, we certainly agree, and that's precisely what this more kind of cultural institutional dimension also aims to highlight. And for instance, one example that we always go back to is Furby and colleagues' research in the United States from 1988 about high voltage power lines, and how back then those were seen as a sign of progress, and therefore well kind of emplaced in certain US landscapes. So obviously, as societies change, these representations will change as well. And again, as we would have illustrated through specific examples, what we want to propose is that those kind of changes in landscape transitions and representations are very much associated with kind of historical ways of looking at things, such as natural versus industrial, human, non-human, civilized versus uncivilized. So these kind of dimensions that shape our way of looking to a lot of things as time goes by. So the other part of the question was if something being considered visual pollution then can change. That's for sure. The relation with informing communities, I'm not so sure about if just informing them about the advantages of such infrastructures would matter that much. Again, because if we consider that people's responses to these infrastructures as well are embedded in the way they currently see landscapes and the specific place where they live and how those infrastructures fit or not with that place, then just informing them might not be enough. I don't think it might be a kind of information problem, so to say.
Yeah, I completely agree. I don't think not necessarily providing information to them will be like a magic trick that changes the situation. And as I said, if you take a look at that paper that Susana and I published a couple of years ago, I'm minded that we spoke to some people who clearly regarded the local countryside as having had high voltage power lines in it for decades. So adding another one doesn't make a huge amount of difference. So they weren't going to object to it. Whereas other people had basically moved into the area thinking it was a lovely countryside, and they were absolutely shocked and horrified that there might be some new power lines being proposed for the area. So even the same location can be seen quite differently by different people depending on the lenses they're using to see that area. So I think the context is something more than just providing information is needed, and engaging with the landscape in a maybe a different kind of way is needed around that. Yeah.
Great, thank you for that. Gundala Hubner has a question. The great questions just keep on rolling. So connected to emotions and how emotions and the emotions we connect to certain infrastructure, how that changes how we see things. Gundala, do you want to ask the question?
So nice how you pronounce my name.
Oh,
okay. No, it's fine. I like it. So yeah, thank you very much. We've talked about the visual impact before, and I like it very much. Your work, you're continuing. And what we find is we also try to analyze emotions, like also Jeremy presented yesterday some parts of it. And what we see is that, and I find this quite interesting, that people who are rejecting wind turbines do have emotions, and these emotions are not more, but they are negative. And the people who are in favor, or at least who accept wind turbines, they have cognitions but not emotions. So it's more neutral. And so we also made some experiments trying to design wind farms theoretically, but visualized, but it was not real wind farms, of course, that were more connected to local identity. And we were trying to figure out how people reacted on this. And we didn't find much impact on emotions. It was what the people showed was, yeah, it fits better. And I think it would be very interesting to see if we follow this line of more integrated into the social perspective design, whether we could change this to more positive emotions, because we know that emotions are strong drivers of behavior. So I find that very interesting if you have knowledge on this, information on this, or whether you could gather some information on this when designing wind farms. So I think that would be very interesting, because I think we have to get more positive emotions. Now it's more cognitive. Acceptance is cognitive, reactance is emotions.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a very interesting question and issue too that really demands more research. I don't know exactly how that would connect with just this framework, but what I would like to say as well, and I think that goes it connects also with Bonnie's comment question, is that obviously, I mean, we are presenting here visual impact or effect as if it's a separated dimension of renewable energy technologies in their relation with social acceptance. But obviously, I think how people represent the visual impact of a certain technology or infrastructure will also be related with how, for instance, the decision-making process happened and if it was fair or not, as Gundula's work also very clearly shows, that the way the decision-making process is perceived, and if it was fair or not, it can really impact on people's perceptions of noise, for instance, and other aspects of wind turbines afterwards. So I think that's the same for the visual impact. So I think that probably also if people are not included in the decision-making process, that might lead to emotions related with the visual impact that are more connected with, I don't know, disgust or this type of emotion and feeling in relation to seeing the turbines or imagining them in the place where they live, for instance.
Yeah, I think I'd I'd agree with Susana. Just say, what do people see when they see a wind turbine? And I think people see different things, and as they're symbolic as much as material, and that's already been emphasized yesterday by Jeremy. He was talking about turbines being symbolic of progress in some way. So I think my response back to Gundula would be to say that emotions are very important and need to be considered, and I think maybe even specified. So, for example, hope might be something that's connected with viewing a turbine as symbolic of some kind of response to a climate emergency, whereas pride might be an emotion associated with a community-led project that after several years of hard work manages to get a turbine installed in the local areas. So the specific emotions might well relate to and be different from others depending on the context and the business model and the process, which Susana's just outlined. It's quite difficult to divorce them all, but I agree it's really important, and even maybe trying to specify particular positive ones and how they might be made more manifest by certain kinds of considerations in renewable energy development would be a really interesting thing to do in future research.
May I just very briefly answer? We ask for hope, for pride, and there was much on the scale, but we also ask for curiosity, and that was the strongest emotion, curiosity. Yeah.
Okay.
Great, thanks for that. Geraint, if you're listening, feel free to jump on if you want to wrap things up. by 4 o'clock. Maybe now is the time to do that. If not, I can go on to a couple more questions.
I'm happy to say take one more question, and then I'll wrap up.
Okay, so Bonnie Ram has a question looking at kind of psychometric theory and whether or not your work related to these visual effects and how they may be connected to processes and issues of fairness through citing.
Yeah, thank you. So I think that's what I was trying to say when I was talking with Gundula as well, is that for sure I think that the visual impact cannot be separated from all the other processes and dimensions that surround and are involved in deploying renewable energy technologies and infrastructure. So yes, I think that's probably if there's like a more participative and fairer process, even, because if it's one that allows precisely people to kind of deploy renewable energy infrastructures in a way that respects more their relations with the place where they live and aspects like that, then for sure I think it will lead to them perceiving a better fit of the project in the place where it's located. And in that sense, we haven't looked at theories of risk perception and more psychometric theories in that sense. But I do think, for instance, now I just referred to disgust before, now as maybe a potential reaction for people when they see a wind turbine, like let's say. And I do think that that might be related as well with risk perception issues, and so people having also certain specific emotions and seeing the visual impact of renewable energy technologies in a more negative lens if they perceived higher risk in relation to those technologies.